Colonel Ed Raff was looking at his watch. With every passing second, he felt a cold, clammy horror growing inside him. He knew that at any moment, dozens of American gliders would appear in the sky. He also knew they were flying straight into hell. Down below, on the fields that were supposed to be their landing zone, the enemy lay in wait. Well-armed, experienced German infantry with machine gunners had turned this land into a perfect killing zone. If they weren't destroyed right now, immediately the sky would turn into a slaughterhouse. Raff watched the clock with one eye, the sky with the other, furiously trying to organize an attack on the German positions, but it was too late. At 20:53, he heard the distant drone of planes. Time had run out. A few minutes later, they appeared, 75 C-47 transport planes, each one towing a giant, clumsy glider. Their exhaust flames, like incandescent white dots, pierced the evening twilight. This low-flying armada was too large, too slow, too perfect a target. Colonel Raff could only watch helplessly. From the German positions, a solid wall of machine gun fire erupted into the sky. Tracer rounds, like the devil's fiery fingers, began to tear planes plus gliders from the sky. Mortally wounded, they would burst into flames. Then, like giant crippled birds, they would fall to the earth, crashing into the hedgerows of Normandy. Those lucky enough to escape the burning wreckage wandered dazed across the battlefield, often becoming easy prey for snipers. This atrocity near the town of La Forge represented just one of thousands of episodes from that day, D-Day, June 6, 1944. But for the men fighting on the ground, it was more than just an episode. It was a desperate attempt to break through to the 6,000 paratroopers of the 82nd Division, who just hours before had been scattered all across Normandy like a handful of bones. Before we begin, I just want to say one thing. This channel tells the stories of people forged from steel and fire, not ordinary flesh and blood. Those who fought for our future deserve to be remembered. If you believe that too, please subscribe. Every video here honors their memory. I voice each story myself because they deserve a human voice, not a cold AI one. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and if your family went through that terrible war, share a few words about them. Let's remember them together. All right, let's get to the story. To understand the horror Colonel Raff witnessed, you have to understand the nightmare his paratrooper brothers had found themselves in. Their mission involved capturing the key town of Sainte-Mère-Église, also the bridges over the Murderette River, to prevent the Germans from striking towards Utah Beach, where the main forces were landing. But nothing went according to plan. Low clouds, intense anti-aircraft fire, plus the inexperience of the transport pilots turned the drop into chaos. Only one regiment landed near its objective. The rest were scattered across the entire Cotentin Peninsula. Below, another surprise awaited them. The Germans had flooded all the lowlands. Many paratroopers, weighed down with 60 kilograms of equipment, landed in swamps, then drowned without firing a single shot. The radio of the division commander, General Ridgway, fell into a river, cutting him off from the rest of the world. They were blind, scattered. The Germans were already coming for him, not just any Germans. Last-minute intelligence revealed that the 91st German Air Landing Division had been moved into the area. A unit equipped with tanks, a unit specially trained to kill paratroopers. The American paratroopers, armed only with light small arms, were about to face tanks. Their only hope was for reinforcements to arrive by sea. General Ridgway knew that, for these reinforcements to break through, they had to be led not by an ordinary officer. They had to be led by a paratrooper. A man who understood that every minute of delay was paid for with the lives of his brothers. Such a man was found in mid-May. Colonel Edson Raff arrived at the 82nd Division headquarters. He was 36. He was already a living legend. His battalion had been the first American parachute unit to see combat in World War II during the landings in North Africa. He was audacious, ambitious. He absolutely hated staff work. He had been pestering his boss, General Omar Bradley, for months, demanding to be sent into combat. Finally, Bradley had given in. But at the 82nd Division, no one was waiting for Raff. His reputation preceded him. For his tough command style, his contempt for weakness, he had earned the nickname Little Caesar. He was personally brave, but had no tolerance for incompetence. General Ridgway plus his deputy, General Gavin, saw no place for such a man on their team. Ridgway told him coldly at their first meeting that his regiments already had commanders. He stated he had no intention of changing anything right before the invasion. Instead, Raff was given a mission that sounded like an insult. He was not to jump. He was to land on Utah Beach with the tanks, the infantry, then lead this armored fist on an 8-mile breakthrough through German defenses to Sainte-Mère-Église. For Raff, who dreamed of commanding a paratrooper regiment, it felt like a humiliation. But he was a soldier. He saw an opportunity. He was the spare colonel. If one of the regimental commanders was killed, Raff would take his place. He just had to complete his mission. Then survive. At the port of Dartmouth, he met his men. This was not an army. It was a wild collection of units cobbled together. A company of Sherman tanks, a few armored cars, a handful of glider infantry. With him was his deputy, Major Ralph Ingersoll, a magazine publisher in New York in his civilian life. A strange pair, the stocky, brutal paratrooper, the thin, intellectual civilian soldier. But they were united by one thing, a wild, unstoppable desire to get into the fight. On June 4th, their small flotilla put out to sea. They were heading for D-Day. As Colonel Raff's small flotilla cut through the waves of the English Channel, absolute silence reigned on the airwaves. The radios were quiet. They were sailing blind into the unknown. They didn't know if the nighttime airborne assault had succeeded. They didn't know if their brothers from the 82nd Division were still alive. They just pushed forward, trusting the plan. They had no idea the plan itself had already devolved into bloody chaos. What had happened in the skies over Normandy a few hours earlier wasn't just a botched landing, it was a slaughter. Thousands of America's finest sons, the elite of the elite, the All-American Division paratroopers, were dropped into the night. They were supposed to be delivered to their targets by the best pilots of the Troop Carrier Command. Instead, they were flown by terrified rookies who had never seen real anti-aircraft fire. When the German flak opened up, when the sky blossomed with black chrysanthemums of death, panic broke out among the pilots. They broke formation, increased speed, threw their planes up, down. They dropped their precious cargo, the men anywhere, just to turn around faster, to escape that hell. This wasn't an airborne assault, it amounted to a dispersal. The American paratroopers were scattered across the Cotentin Peninsula like a handful of seeds thrown to the wind. Only one regiment, the 505th, landed more or less in its zone. The rest found themselves tens of miles from their objectives, completely alone in the heart of enemy territory. Below, another enemy awaited them, one that was not on the maps. General Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been preparing for an invasion. He knew paratroopers would come. He had turned the fields of Normandy into a death trap. All the lowlands, all the meadows were flooded. The paratroopers, weighed down with 60 kilograms of equipment, landed not on soft grass, but in dark, icy water. Many of them, elite warriors who had gone through years of training, simply drowned in the swamps without firing a single shot. Their bodies were found for days afterward, tangled in the lines of their own parachutes. Even those who were lucky enough to land on dry ground were blind, deaf. The glider carrying General Ridgway's powerful radio crashed directly into the Murderette River. The division commander, the man supposed to lead 6,000 fighters, was left without communications. He became a king without a kingdom, a general who could speak neither to his own men nor to the rest of the world. The Germans thought the chaos would break them. They thought the scattered paratroopers would become easy prey. They were wrong. The chaos did not break the Americans. It only made them angrier. Even in this hell in complete isolation, they began to do their job. They were not an army, they were a pack of wolves. Every one of them knew what to do. Small groups, assembling in the darkness, began to hunt. A battalion from the 505th Regiment immediately attacked, seizing the key bridge at La Fière. Another group of about 100 men captured the bridge at Chef de Pont. In Sainte-Mère-Église itself, paratroopers who landed directly in the town gave the Germans a bloody fight in the streets, raising the American flag over the town hall. It became the first liberated town in France. Generals Ridgway, Gavin, instead of sitting in a non-existent headquarters, ran across the battlefield, gathering their scattered men like shepherds rounding up a flock. They personally, under fire, forged a defensive line out of this chaos. Eventually, they managed to create something resembling a perimeter, a triangle anchored by Sainte-Mère-Église, La Fière, Chef de Pont. They blocked the key roads, prepared for the German response. That response was not long in coming. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the infantry of the 91st German Division, those same specialists in hunting paratroopers, struck the American positions north of Sainte-Mère-Église. 3 hours later, another German regiment, supported by armor, assaulted the bridge at La Fière. Thanks to the wild, almost suicidal bravery of the paratroopers, both attacks were repulsed. The Americans were holding, but to the south, they faced a dead end. There, between Sainte-Mère-Église, the crossroads at La Forge, lay a long, gentle ridge known on the maps as Hill 20. This hill became an insurmountable obstacle for them. The irony was that this key point was not defended by elite German troops. It was held by a battalion of Osttruppen, former Soviet prisoners of war, mostly Georgians, whom the Nazis had given a choice: a slow death in a camp or service in the Wehrmacht. They were considered unreliable, but their German commander, Captain Stiller, had armed them to the teeth with machine guns, anti-tank guns. Most importantly, from this hill, they could sweep the entire valley marked on the maps as Landing Zone W, the zone where the glider reinforcements were scheduled to arrive that evening. General Ridgway understood if he didn't take that hill, the evening glider landing would turn into a slaughter. But he lacked the forces. His men were scattered, engaged in heavy fighting on other fronts. Worst of all, he couldn't warn anyone. His radio was silent. As evening fell, despair washed over him. Had the landing at Utah Beach even succeeded? Colonel Raff, his tanks, should have been here by now. But there was no word from them. Had the 82nd Division been abandoned to die in Normandy? While General Ridgway, his paratroopers scattered across hell, prayed for a miracle, that miracle was already happening. A few miles away on the bloody coast of France, America was unleashing its fury. The landing at Utah Beach was far from the perfect plan drawn up by the staff planners in England. It was chaos. Pure, unadulterated, bloody chaos. Navigational errors, a strong current, had pushed the first assault waves 2,000 yards south of their designated sectors. For any other army, it would have been a disaster. Panic, failure, but not for the Americans. On the beach, amidst the explosions, the whistle of bullets, stood Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., the president's son, the oldest, highest-ranking officer to land in the first wave. He surveyed the chaos, looked at his map, looked at the unfamiliar shoreline, then made a decision that would become legendary. Instead of trying to get back to the original plan, he pointed his cane inland, proclaiming they would start the war right from there. This wasn't just bravado. It represented the spirit of this army, the spirit of men who didn't follow a plan. They became the plan. While the infantry of the 4th Division, led by this iron-willed general, began to chew their way north onto this same wrong but now American beach, the hope for the 82nd Division began to land. Colonel Raff's armored fist. Lieutenant Penley's reconnaissance platoon was the first to hit the beach at 9:25 in the morning. Their baptism by fire began immediately. Despite all efforts at waterproofing, several of their vehicles drowned in seawater as they rolled off the ramps. For 45 frantic minutes, under heavy German artillery fire, they tinkered with their engines, trying to get them started. 45 minutes in hell. Penley lost 2 jeeps, had 4 men wounded before he could get his battered platoon to some kind of cover. At 1400 hours, the main force arrived. The landing craft carrying Raff's tanks, his glider infantry. Major Ingersoll recalled how the skipper of their LCT, like a cowboy taming a wild bull, smashed the ship onto the beach with such force that their huge tanks barely got their tracks wet, rolling off the ramp onto dry sand. Each Sherman that crawled ashore looked like a steel beast emerging from the depths. They lumbered over the dunes, disappeared, preparing for battle. The tankers, cursing everything, began to strip the waterproofing, the useless deep waiting stacks from their machines. The air filled with the smell of diesel, smoke, salt water. Raff's command jeep, towed by a Sherman, was the last to come ashore. A small, open vehicle with an armored windshield, a heavy 50 caliber machine gun on a pintle mount. It was in this vehicle, not a tank, that Little Caesar intended to lead the breakout. He wanted to see the fight. He wanted to smell it. At 17:30, the command everyone had been waiting for came. Mount up! The infantrymen, 4 to a tank, jumped onto the sun-baked armor. Penley's armored cars formed up in the vanguard. The column moved out. They maneuvered through the incredible chaos of the beach, clogged with equipment, men, the wounded, the dead. Then they moved inland along a 2-mile causeway known as Exit 2. In a few minutes, they reached the first village, Sainte-Marie-du-Mont, just 5 miles from their final objective. No one opposed them. Raff recalled, "It felt like a Sunday drive in the country." Now, turning west toward La Forge, he finally understood why everything had been so quiet. Up ahead, on both sides of the road, moving cautiously from hedgerow to hedgerow, was American infantry. They were soldiers of the 3rd Battalion, 8th Infantry Regiment. They had landed in the morning. All day, they had been methodically, step by step, clawing their way into Normandy. By 1900 hours, they had reached their D-Day objective, the crossroads at La Forge. The infantrymen digging in there warned Raff. 1,000 yards to the north, on a long ridge, the enemy was dug in. They had already shelled the forward platoons. A quick look at the map confirmed Raff's worst fears. It was Hill 20, the last obstacle before Sainte-Mère-Église. Between him, the hill, lay that same marshy, tree-covered valley. Landing Zone W. Raff assessed the situation instantly. Time was running out. In an hour and a half, the gliders would start arriving. He recalled it was imperative to clear that valley for the glider units from England. He ordered his tanks to attack. But before committing his Shermans, he needed to know what was waiting for them. He called for Lieutenant Penley. The order was simple, deadly. Take your armored car, go up the road, see what's there. 1 Sherman would follow for fire support. The small group moved forward cautiously for 300 yards. Then a gun on Hill 20 barked. The shell went through the thin-skinned armored car like a needle through cloth. But it didn't stop there. It flew on, tore the track off the Sherman, following behind. The crews of both knocked-out vehicles bailed out, scrambled for cover. The reconnaissance in force was over before it began. But now, Raff knew where the enemy was. The enemy had shown its teeth. Little Caesar was pleased. The chaos of the reconnaissance in force had given him what he valued above all else, clarity. Now he knew where the enemy was. He knew what they were made of. He knew what he had to do. Time was slipping away. Every second brought the inevitable slaughter in the sky closer. Colonel Raff began his game. He was not a strategist who draws arrows on a map. He was a street fighter. His plan was simple, brutal, deadly. The first order went to Major Ingersoll, his publisher deputy. Find the 8th Regiment's artillery. I want fire on that hill. Now Ingersoll, like a hound, took off to carry out the order. The task was simple. Force the Germans to keep their heads down while his tanks rolled over them. The second order, by radio, went to Captain Crawford, the tank company commander. Raff roared for him to deploy his men, his armor on both sides of the road, to take that damn hill. It was 1930. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in bloody hues. It was the perfect backdrop for what was about to happen. Private Lucius Young, riding on the armor of one of the Shermans, felt the engine beneath him roar with new power. The tanks moved forward. This was not a cautious maneuver. It was a battering ram. The Shermans plowed straight across the field. The infantrymen clinging to them tried not to fall under the tracks. Then Hill 20 answered. It spat death. Young recalled he, with 3 other guys, had moved up to the nearest hedgerow. One tank went up the road beside them. It got knocked out. Another tried to break through. It got hit too. A third went across the field, but he figured it got hit as well. It was a perfect killing zone. The guns of the Osttruppen, though captured Soviet 76mm, fired accurately, relentlessly. Every shot found its mark. The Shermans, which had seemed invincible on the beach, were turning into burning coffins here in this valley. Within minutes, C Company lost 2 more tanks. The losses among the crews, the infantry riding on the armor, were horrific. 2nd Lieutenant Joe Mercer was mortally wounded. But the Americans did not stop. It was not in their nature. They kept pushing forward, through the fire, through the explosions, trying to close the distance. Raff's tanks had already crossed half the valley. One more push, they could reach the base of the hill. At that moment, the din of battle attracted the attention of the big brass. Colonel James Van Fleet, commander of the entire 8th Infantry Regiment, whose soldiers were dug in nearby, arrived at Raff's position. Raff saw him as a savior. He rushed to the colonel. I pleaded with him, Raff recounted. I pleaded with him to commit his regiment to an attack to dislodge the enemy. He explained that in an hour, the gliders would be here. That it wouldn't be a fight, but a turkey shoot. That hundreds of lives were at stake. Van Fleet's response was a punch to the gut. He refused. He objected, Raff recalled, saying he had reached his forward line for the day. It was the quintessence of all the horror of war. A few hundred yards away, Raff's men were dying trying to complete the mission. In the sky, an hour's flight away, hundreds of other Americans were flying toward their deaths. Here, on the ground, stood a colonel who refused to fight because he had met his daily objective. For Raff, a paratrooper for whom only victory or death existed. Such logic was madness. But Van Fleet was an infantry commander. He had his orders, he had reached his goal. If it meant a few hundred men would die in gliders 1,000 yards away, that was not his problem. Then the news got even worse. Captain Crawford reported over the radio, his Shermans were starting to bog down in the marshy valley. A moment later, a message came from Ingersoll. The artillery company they had been counting on had ceased fire. They were out of ammunition. Raff suddenly realized he was trapped. He didn't have the strength to take Hill 20. That would require Van Fleet's entire 3,000-man regiment, but its commander was standing right beside him, just shaking his head. Then, at an altitude between 750 and 1,500 feet, 75 C-47 planes appeared over Utah Beach. It was the first echelon of Operation Elmira, a massive glider landing carrying 2 artillery battalions, anti-tank guns, medics, tons of ammunition so desperately needed by the paratroopers. The pilots, with no communication with Ridgway's headquarters, knew nothing of the situation on the ground. They were blindly following the plan. Raff watched them with horror, like in a movie where you know the whole plot. He recounted, "I realized that the burning, smoking tanks in the valley in the evening light looked like markers for the landing zone. They unerringly released their gliders right over that valley. In that same instant, every soldier of the Ostbataillon 795 on Hill 20 raised his weapon to the sky. The whole hill started crackling with small arms fire directed at the planes." Major Ingersoll recalled, "One of the C-47 transports suddenly started smoking. It roared over our heads, crashed into a field right behind us. The pilots in the engineless Horsa, plus Waco gliders, had no choice. They had to land straight into that hell. The gliders were crashing into the hedgerows all over the valley," Raff recalled. "One or two even landed right on the enemy-occupied hill." Ingersoll added, "It was too small a landing zone for that many gliders. The operations planners had made a fatal mistake. They chose a valley that wasn't just occupied by the enemy, it proved completely unsuitable for landing. The fields, which from the air looked flat, were tiny, like postage stamps, surrounded by 50-foot trees. Some of them were flooded. Others were covered with Rommel's asparagus, thick poles driven into the ground to tear gliders to pieces. An apocalypse was approaching. Colonel Raff could only watch helplessly as the sky above him turned into a graveyard. Colonel Raff stood on the ground, watching as the sky above him turned into a graveyard. He was powerless. He, Little Caesar, a man used to breaking the enemy, the circumstances over his knee, could only watch as his reinforcements, his hope, were shot down in the air like ducks in a hunt. For the pilots in the engineless horses, in the Wacos, this was not a battle. It represented an apocalypse. They had nowhere to run. They could not maneuver. They were tied to their fate, as if to flying coffins. Their only job was to land anywhere, then survive. But the approaching ground was no less terrifying than the sky. The American planners in their cozy offices in England had made a fatal mistake. Landing Zone W was not just occupied by the enemy. It amounted to a trap. The fields, which from the air looked flat, were in reality tiny, postage stamp-sized patches of land, surrounded by 50-foot trees, ancient Norman hedgerows as hard as concrete. Some of them were flooded, others were covered with Rommel's asparagus, thick, sharpened poles driven into the ground to tear gliders to pieces. One pilot, unable to find a large field, settled for a small one. He dropped his flaps, came in for a landing at 70 miles per hour. The glider bounced twice. On the second bounce, at a height of 10 feet, it slammed into a row of trees. The wings were torn off as if they were made of paper. The fuselage, deprived of its wings, plowed through the ground for another 10 yards, then came to a stop just a few feet from Raff's position. Flight Officer Ben Ward was trying to land his Horsa, not knowing that enemy fire had damaged his brakes. "Just hang on," he told himself as his glider slammed sideways into a hedgerow. The sound of plywood splintering, the crunch of plexiglass shattering like sugar glass filled my ears. Then silence. I was stunned by the impact. Swaying, I got to my feet, wondering if I was still in one piece. The Waco glider carrying Private Menno Christner hit a tree, simply disintegrated. Christner was thrown clear. He survived, but discovered he had broken 3 ribs in the impact. Even with punctured lungs, instead of calling for help, he rushed back to the wreckage to pull his pilots from under it. Once on the ground, he looked around in confusion. I could hear shooting from all sides. I didn't know where the hell to go. It was chaos. On the ground, RAF soldiers, risking their own lives, rushed to help. They formed rescue parties, pulling the wounded from the wrecked aircraft, dragging them to cover. Major Ingersoll, the man who just yesterday had been running a magazine, was now running across the battlefield, trying to gather anyone who could hold a weapon into improvised infantry squads. He hoped to gather enough men for a final desperate assault on Hill 20. But those who had survived these crashes were not warriors. They were ghosts. Their eyes were empty. They were so shocked by their brutal introduction to the war that Raff realized they would be of no use this evening. As if this hell were not enough, as the sun touched the horizon, a second wave appeared in the sky, another 100 gliders. Colonel Raff could only watch with a helpless fury as history repeated itself. The Georgians on Hill 20 opened fire with renewed vigor. Again, young American pilots, cursing everything, were forced to land their fragile plywood machines in the semi-darkness, among the hedgerows, the trees, the wreckage of the first wave. An overloaded Horsa carrying Private Wilmer Runninger clipped a tree. There was a terrible loud noise, he recalled. The glider started to fall apart before we even touched the ground. I was thrown to the floor. My shoulder went through a hole in the floor. As the glider slid along the ground, my head, my shoulder were banging against the hard, rocky ground over again. First Lieutenant Edgar Schroeder also survived a rough landing. We came down with a crash in the middle of a field, smashed into a hedgerow. He said, I thought I had broken my leg, but after throwing off a ton of wreckage, I managed to crawl out through what was left of the nose, get up. He was lucky. Just bruises, contusions, a slight concussion. The Wacos, the Horsas, fell from the sky like autumn leaves. A paratrooper, Sergeant Otis Sampson, rushed to help one of the gliders. As I ran up, a hole started to appear in the side of the glider. Men were kicking their way out like bees from a hive. They were climbing out of that hole, jumping to the ground, running for the trees, disappearing. I tried to tell them they were in friendly territory, but they ran right past me as if I wasn't there. Not everyone was lucky enough to land in friendly territory. Wehrmacht Sergeant Rudy Escher recalled stumbling upon a crashed Horsa that night. We opened the side door. He wrote, there sat 2 Americans completely motionless with their weapons at the ready. They must have been petrified with fear. Escher's group took them prisoner, then destroyed the glider with grenades. It was a slaughter, but it was not a complete failure. The American spirit, that American stubbornness, created miracles even in this hell. Despite the catastrophic losses, Operation Elmira delivered 15 of 24 howitzers to Ridgeway, 42 of 59 jeeps, 33 tons of ammunition. All 8 of the anti-tank guns the paratroopers so desperately needed arrived intact. One of them landed so close to the bridge at Chef DuPont that it was immediately unloaded, then put into action against the attacking German tanks. They paid a terrible price, but they damn it got the job done. The Flying Coffins, as they were nicknamed, had failed this test. Fewer than half the Wacos landed intact. Of the 139 horses, 56 were completely destroyed. The British wooden gliders just fell to pieces on impact, Raff remarked contemptuously later. After Normandy, the Americans never used the Horsa in combat again. Night fell on the battlefield. Continuing the advance on Sainte-Mère-Église would have been madness. Raff let his men rest while he went back to find the commander of the 4th Division. He found General Barton at his headquarters on Utah Beach. He convinced him. He made him understand that Hill 20 was not just a daily objective met. It was a cancer that had to be cut out. Barton agreed to commit the 8th Infantry Regiment to an attack at dawn. When the short-sighted Normandy night finally began to give way to the bloody dawn of June 7th, Colonel Raff was no longer a supplicant. He was an executioner come to collect. His fury, his stubbornness, his absolute contempt for the staff logic of daily tasks completed had won. General Barton gave the order. The 8th Infantry Regiment, which just yesterday had been calmly digging in, preparing for breakfast, was now to attack their objective, Hill 20. But this was no longer just a fight for a tactical high ground. This was revenge. Revenge for the slaughter in the sky. Revenge for the pilots shot down in their parachutes. revenge for the smashed flying coffins that stuck out of the Norman fields like grotesque skeletons. At the tip of this vengeful spear were Captain Crawford's tanks, the survivors. The attack did not begin immediately. It took time for Colonel Van Fleet, whose inexperienced infantry had not yet smelled real gunpowder, to get organized. To Raff, this time seemed an eternity. Every minute of delay felt like a knife twisting. He knew that just beyond the hill, his paratrooper brothers were bleeding out, repelling attacks from German tanks. Finally, at noon, the attack began. It was not a sophisticated tactical operation. It was a brutal frontal assault. The American infantry, supported by the roar of the Shermans, charged. The Osttruppen on the hill met them with a hail of fire. They fought fiercely. For them, being captured meant an uncertain future, perhaps a return to Soviet camps, which was worse than death. But they were not just facing infantry. They were facing the fury of an entire army, avenging its own. By noon on June 7th, it was all over. Hill 20 had been taken. The infantrymen of the 8th Regiment, in their first real battle, captured over 175 prisoners. More importantly, they had finally broken the bloody stalemate. The way to the 82nd Division was open. At that moment, Colonel Raff once again unleashed his hounds. Lieutenant Penley's reconnaissance platoon, the first to see action on this front, was the first to break through. Their armored cars raced west, towards Chef Dupont, towards Sainte-Mère-Église. It was a race to bring the news. Help is coming. Following them, in an unarmored jeep, rode the most incredible character of this battle, Brigadier General Ted Roosevelt, Jr. This old warrior, the president's son, should have been in a headquarters. Instead, he had landed in the first wave. Now, with a broad smile on his face, he was driving to meet the surrounded paratroopers. He greeted the exhausted, grim General Ridgway, commander of the 82nd, with his signature phrase. He asked which way the picnic was, as if they had met not in the middle of a battlefield, but in Central Park. That joke, that undisguised, arrogant contempt for danger, instantly broke the tension. Everyone who heard it understood. Everything would be all right. The real Americans had arrived. Around noon, the tanks rolled into Sainte-Mère-Église. With a roar, a screech, Colonel Raff's Shermans entered the first liberated town in France. For the exhausted paratroopers, who had been fighting German tanks for a day, with only bazookas, with grenades, this sound was sweeter than any music. It was the sound of the cavalry coming to the rescue. The infantrymen from F Company immediately joined their parent battalion, which had arrived by glider. Captain Crawford's tanks, without wasting a minute, went straight into the fight, helping to repel another German counterattack. The tireless Major Ingersoll, the publisher turned warrior, spent the entire day racing his jeep between Utah Beach, Sainte-Mère-Église, organizing convoys of ammunition, of supplies. The mission was accomplished. Task Force Raff had broken through. At that moment, Colonel Ed Raff, Little Caesar, found himself out of a job. He had carried out his order. His strange cobbled-together unit dissolved into other divisions. He was, once again, the spare colonel. But not for long. Fate, which had been so cruel to his reinforcements, had a new twist in store for him. The chief of staff of the 82nd Division was seriously wounded during a glider crash. General Ridgway, who just a few weeks ago hadn't even wanted Raff in his division, now temporarily appointed this extra colonel to one of its key positions. That, however, was just the beginning. A week later, word came down. Colonel George Millett, commander of the 507th Parachute Regiment, had been taken prisoner. Ridgway, without a moment's hesitation, gave command of the regiment to Ed Raff, the man who had been denied a command, the man given the humiliating task of breaking out from the beach, the man who had walked through fire, through hell, finally got what he had been fighting for. He got his regiment. Now he was going to show the Germans what the true fury of an American paratrooper looked like. Colonel Raff's story was just beginning. Colonel Raff's story was just beginning. He got his regiment, he got his war. He would go through it with honor, making another combat jump during Operation Varsity in March of 1945, then staying in the Army after the victory. He became one of the founders of the Special Operations Forces, also the man credited with introducing the legendary Green Beret. Little Caesar left his bloody but glorious mark on history. But for many of the men who fought under his command on that long day, fate was less kind. Their stories did not have happy endings. They were just short, tragic strokes in the book of war. Private Lucius Young, who had ridden on the armor of a Sherman, who had miraculously survived the attack on Hill 20, was killed 3 days later. On June 9th, during the bloody assault on the causeway near Lafayette, he took a bullet to the neck, Captain James Crawford, the tank company commander whose Shermans were the first to break through to Sainte-Mère-Église, died in that very same attack. Lieutenant Gerald Penley, the scout who was the first to see combat near Hill 20, was killed in September as his unit entered Belgium. They did their job, then they paid the ultimate price for it. The land of Normandy bore the scars of that day for a long time. An American staff officer, driving through the area in mid-June, wrote in his diary about how the roads were just lined with wrecked gliders. He described some with their fabric stripped away, others burned to a crisp, hanging in trees, in hedgerows like grotesque decorations. He noted that how men managed to get out of that alive, then fight the way they did, was some kind of miracle. It wasn't a miracle. It was American stubbornness, American fury. It was a will to win that proved stronger than any German plan, stronger than any perfect killing zone. The bloody slaughter in Landing Zone W, the heroism of Colonel Raff's unit that broke through the lines, none of it was in vain. By establishing a link between the airborne, the main forces on Utah Beach, the Allies were finally able to close the ring around the Cotentin Peninsula. This allowed them to cut off, then eventually capture the vital port of Cherbourg. With the capture of Cherbourg, a new, even bloodier phase of the war began, the battle for France. D-Day was just the beginning. Months of fighting, thousands of lives lost, still lay ahead. But on that day, June 6, 1944, on the fields of Normandy, the Germans saw something new. They had prepared for a battle. They had prepared to resist a professional army. But they were not prepared for the Americans. They weren't ready for generals like Ted Roosevelt, who would start the war right from here. They weren't ready for paratroopers who, scattered across the sky, would start hunting instead of surrendering. They definitely were not ready for men like Colonel Ed Raff, for men who, once given an order, would go straight ahead, through the fire, through hell, through death itself, to carry it out. That day, the Germans saw what happens when America stops holding back. It became a lesson they would remember forever. The story of Colonel Raff, of his men, represents just one page out of the thousands of pages from that long day, but it perfectly shows what that army was made of. Write in the comments what you think was the main reason for their success: the audacity of Colonel Raff, the bravery of his soldiers, or just the blind luck that allowed them to break through the German trap. The memory of them stays alive as long as we speak of them. But this story isn't the end. Right now, 2 more legends are appearing on your screen. 2 incredible tales of men forged from steel, from fire. If you have the time, dedicate it to the memory of more heroes. Thank you for watching.